that sin shall not have dominion over you. Now this verse also states, well, let me back up, I won't go there. Let me ask a question. I'll ask this question. What is the reason No, I won't go there either. Okay, let me go here. When the apostle uses the terms under the law and under grace, he's referring to two different eras, two different economies. To live under the law of Moses was to lock yourself into an economy which actually aggravated sin but gave you no strength to overcome it. You see, that has been talking about these two realms the whole time as we've been going through here. The transfer from this economy to that economy. It's been transferred from the old economy to the new economy. Now he's talking about the transfer here from the Mosaic law, which is a slightly different thing, from being transferred from Adam's realm to Christ's realm. But the law was something which operated within Adam's realm. It was another power which came along and gave, if you like, extra force to the power of sin. Because sin is aggravated by the law. And so we are not under the law. We don't live in that economy where there is no power, no strength to overcome sin. On the other hand, we do live under the covenant of grace. And that means that we have constant access to the grace of God through the Spirit to gain victory over sin, just as he's been talking about. Now there are those who suggest that the term under the law has a negative connotation of legalism. And we've heard this bandied about, particularly nowadays. It really is way out of context with the whole passage here. They would say that we've been freed from legalism and are now under the dispensation of grace. Well, in the book of Galatians, Paul definitely does warn against the dangers of legalism. And he says there, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage." And what he's writing about there to the Galatians was the tendency for the Judaizers that would come in and want once again to introduce them back under the old economy, under the law. And that's what it's speaking about. And it's specifically mentioned in that book of Galatians that they were looking towards things like circumcision. They were looking, but that was the biggest issue that was raised there. But the dietary laws are also raised there. And neither of those things, and this is a very important point when you're considering what is true legalism, neither of those issues, and you can scour everything in the book of Galatians, you'll find that they are the issues which are raised. No moral issues such as fornication or any of the other critical issues like drunkenness or issues of morality, ethics. They're not raised at all. Only ceremonial law. Circumcision, dietary laws, which do not issue out of the character of God and are not therefore permanent. Legalism has to do with going back under the law, engaging those kind of things. Now, if you're going to talk about legalism applying to moral issues, you are way out of line, because the moral issues are permanent. They issue forth from the character of God. That has to do with why we adhere to standards, folks. Those things issue from the character of God. And you can go to the other passages also in the New Testament which speak about legalism, and they all deal with moral aspects of the law. the ceremonial aspects of the law. So there is the danger of going back into wanting to keep the whole law. And Paul says, if you want to keep the law to be saved, then you can forget grace, because you put yourself back under the bondage of that. You're going to have to be perfect in everything then if you're going to go that way, folks. So that's legalism. But here in Romans, Paul is not concerned at all with correcting the encroachments of legalism. In fact, quite to the contrary, his main concern appears to be that this statement could be taken as a license for sin. That's exactly his concern in the first verse. Remember, the first verse says, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid," he says. And he's so concerned about that he raises it again with a slightly different complexion here, down in verse 14. And people begin to realise how God's grace does in fact cover all of our sin. That grace even abounds over all of our sins for our salvation, for our justification. He's concerned that we don't abuse the grace of God. And we can see that by virtue of the fact of what the next verse says, where he asks the questions, "What then? Shall we sin because we're not under grace, not under the law, but under grace?" And he says once again, "God forbid." And furthermore, if Paul really is talking about liberation from legalism here, then, as Thomas Schreiner puts it, it is not apparent how being released from legalism grants one power over sin. In other words, how does release from legalism guarantee the promise that sin shall not have a dominion over you? Because remember, that's what it has to function as. It has to make that point. It acts as a ground to buttress that first phrase. And if that means that if the statement about grace, not being under law, under grace, means we're free from legalism, that's got nothing to do with guaranteeing us power over sin presently. In fact, if you go a little bit further down that track and you insist that this is meaning that we are free from legalism, then you wind up in a dangerous position which teaches that believers are under no obligation to keep law at all. Historically, we pointed out that verse 14 has been used in the past by the antinomianists back in the 17th century. They were those who justified anything by grace, in the name of grace. I can do this, I'm free from the law, I can do this, I'm not worried about that. Don't have to worry about standards, you don't have to worry about all this. That is an absolute abuse. That is the very thing which Paul is saying God forbid to. Complete lack of understanding of what Romans 6 is all about. If we go that way, folks, we play into the hands of the devil. It's this kind of shoddy theology that has contributed to the grace will cover all mentality that is so popular. It's just trotted out whenever a Christian wants a loophole to escape concrete obedience. Look, our flesh is desperately wicked. It can invent all kinds of reasons. And if it's a theological justification, wow, I'm standing on theological ground here. There are dozens of books like that in Courant. Swindoll's book, The Grace Awakening, was one that I used in my thesis 16 years ago. I had a passion. I came out of the evangelical music. I used to use rock and roll. And I knew how to use it too. I was a trained musician. I thought I was going to win the world through CCM. We used to play at big concerts with, kids, hundreds of kids at Easter camps. And I can remember going out there thinking, something's not right here. Something is just not right. I believe God does save some people, but we were certainly not representing His holiness. Oh yes, this is a wicked age we live in. It's a deceitful age. This perversion of true grace is invoked to cover so much which is outrageous and so much which is sinful in the church today. When will the children of God learn that sin is a deadly enemy? And we have to get serious about it. We are not in a playground. We are on a battlefield. That is why the apostle specifically uses that kind of imagery all the way through here. Many believers today have been duped into taking a passive stance towards sin, but in so doing they're unwittingly yielding to the old master, and they wonder why they can't have power over sins that they really know are sin. They've been so desensitised to these other things, they've been yielding to them. And I won't worry about that. Look, I tell you, the more you will obey God, the more light you will have, the more discernment that you will have. Now, these are the same folks who will tolerate everybody except other believers who choose not to follow headlong into that error. Anyone who requires a certain standard, promotes a higher than usual, and that wouldn't be hard in our society, discipline or strictness or strength of moral character, you know what? It's getting that way that they are looked upon with suspicion. That's tragic. Absolutely tragic. At worst, they're accused of legalism because of the prevailing ignorance of what true legalism is about. Satan has been very, very clever. And to make it even more galling, these very same brethren claim to be standing, as I said, on the highest possible theological ground. They say, brother, we're not under the law, we're under grace. They're sad. Thinking all the time that they don't have to be vigilant. I want to be honest, folks. Let's be honest with ourselves. All this is just the plain old antinomianism in a new packaging. Nomos means law, by the way. Anti means against law. And that first sermon where we looked at antinomianism in the context of the early verses of chapter 6, I gave the example of a man who was a friend of one of the pastors over in America. And he would sing that wonderful old hymn by Philip Bliss and exchange the original line of the words in that hymn, and he would sing words like this: free from the law, oh happy condition. I can't remember the words. Yes, sin all I want with easy remission. Isn't that terrible? But that is the mindset. You must have taken that down, Tim. Thank you for rescuing me there at a critical moment. But folks, all I'm trying to say is that's not biblical grace. That's a counterfeit grace. And what else would we expect in a society like this that we live in? I want to take you to the book of Titus, Titus chapter 2, as we come to a conclusion. Grace is much, much bigger than just God justifying our sins freely. Grace is help of all kinds, not just that, but help to make us holy. We are to come to the throne of grace in time of need and to come boldly that we might obtain help in time of need. Titus chapter 2, verse 11. For the grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men.